Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full-contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk.
Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everybody, you're listening to Audiobookish. My name's Fahed Rahman, and as always, I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And today we will be discussing The Tusks of Extinction by Ray Nayler, as narrated by Stefan Rudnicki and Gabrielle de Cuir. And I'll be reading out the synopsis for this. When you bring back a long extinct species, there's more to success than DNA. Moscow has resurrected the mammoth, but someone must teach them how to be mammoths, or they'll be doomed to die out again. The late Dr. Damira, the world's foremost expert in elephant behaviour, is called in to help. While she was murdered a year ago, her digitized consciousness is uploaded into the brain of a mammoth. Can she help the magnificent creatures fend off poachers long enough for their species to take hold? And will she ever discover the real reason they were brought back? A tense eco-thriller from a new master of the genre. So this was your choice, Poppy. How did you first come across the title?
So I first came across it because of a YouTuber called Jen Campbell, who is very big in the book world. She was a bookseller for years and years and is now an author and reviewer. And it was on her kind of list of books to look out for 2024. So yeah, I came across it off that and thought that it sounded really good off that blurb.
Yeah, sure. And I think this is only available on Audible. Am I correct?
No, so it's by Spotify,
yeah, okay.
So you can definitely get it on there. You can get it on Audible. I think it is available on other places, depends where you want to go for cheapest and stuff like that.
Okay, sure. So I think I'll start off the discussion on this one. So I found this to be a really dense audio, but usually when I'm listening to audio, I can do other things off in the background, but with this, like the text, I found to be kind of quite dense. Not in like a bad way, not in terms of a way that is like difficult to understand, but it demanded your full attention to kind of to follow the story. I found, I especially found the beginning bits a little bit confusing at the start before I kind of got into the flow of, you know, the way the narrator's voice and kind of what the story was about a little bit. Did you find that to be similar to yourself? Were you able to kind of go? I know you sit down and tend to listen to it as a thing, but did you find it to be kind of, you couldn't kind of float off and kind of daydream a bit? Did you find that as well?
Yeah, I think I did find that as well. And especially, so I don't always read the blurbs before I listen to books. Like I very rarely do, but this one I did. And I definitely think it helped because I understood the concept, especially the bit of like kind of the fact that Damira's mind as an elephant specialist has been put into the body of a resurrected mammoth. And just knowing that going in helped me understand it. I think some people could look at that as being spoiled the beginning because it kind of intentionally makes that unclear, or you glean that as you go on and stuff like that. So I felt a little bit like it had spoiled some bits of what the book was trying to do, but I felt that if I hadn't known that in advance, then it just wouldn't have made sense, is kind of how I felt about that.
Yeah, so I think I agree with that. Yeah, it's just I don't know what it was about the beginning. It's just kind of what's going on? Sort of thing going on. But yeah, that blurb at the bit of, reading the blurb, I think does help out a bit. It's described as like an eco thriller, and I'm not too sure that's a correct description, because when I think about thrillers, I think about stories with lots of twists and turns, and I think there is lots of tension in this story in terms of like how it's going to resolve, but I don't think there were massive kind of like, especially considering its length, it's kind of it's a fairly short like novella. I don't think there was massive like twists and turns and revelations and that sort of thing. Do you think that eco thriller is the right description for this?
I certainly see what you mean, and I definitely think that it leans heavily on the eco message side of it, and at some point really kind of to the detriment of the story. And I do think partly because, as you say, because it is so short, and not only is it short, but what you don't get from the blurb is that it's split between two mostly perspectives, or at least two perspectives, as opposed to just focusing on, which is kind of what I thought it was going to be, just focusing on Damira and her story of it. So not only is it already short, but you're also getting, the story being split in half, because you then have to hear the story from two different sides and stuff like that. So you then don't get a lot of time for character development, for twists and turns, and for overall story. And I did feel that was a shame, because I think you definitely can do both. And by meaning that it lent into the eco side of it more, I don't mean that it did that too much. I just mean that it didn't bring the story up with it. It wasn't doing both things, I felt. So yeah, it has really important messages about poaching as kind of the main bit, and animal conservation, the ethics around that, the complicated ethics around that, including, you bring funding into it, you bring politics into it, all sorts of stuff like that is really important and interesting. But yeah, it did feel a little bit too much that it was about the message of anti-poaching and not enough about delivering that message through an immersive story, is kind of how I found it.
Yeah, so there were 3 point of view characters. We've got Dr. Damira. She's the elephant behavioral expert that was murdered, and like her digital consciousness has been uploaded into the brain of the mammoth. So we kind of see her things kind of being like the matriarch of this herd of mammoths that have been kind of Jurassic Park style resurrected. We've got Sliverstav, who's this poacher character, who's, him and I believe his father and other people from that part of Russia have gone into this reserve to basically poach mammoth tusks and ivory and that sort of thing. And then the last set of characters that we've got Vladimir and Anthony, Vladimir is a Russian expat who's kind of gone on a hunting trip with his husband Anthony to kind of kill a mammoth. And I think in terms of like the thriller side of thing, I think Vladimir's relationship with Anthony gets the closest to the thriller end, because it's kind of like he's discovering things about his husband that he might not necessarily like, or things that he probably did know already, but was kind of ignoring a little bit. But we've got those 3 point of view characters. I think that's probably a good point to start talking about the narration. How did you feel like the narration was handled in this one?
So the narration is split between a female narrator and a male narrator, and the female has the Damira perspective chapters and the male narrator has the other 2 perspective chapters. And my overall feeling is that really wasn't needed. And I think we had a similar criticism about the Omar Epps book that we listened to.
Oh, yes.
It very much felt like it was just going, oh, well, there's men and there's women in it, so we can't just have the woman do all of it or just have the man do all of it. We'll have to split it. You know what I mean? Especially because, it wasn't split. Like, it wasn't a clear 2 perspective thing and they've each got individual voices. Instead, it was the man gets the male perspective ones and the woman gets the female perspective ones. It was almost as if they felt like one narrator couldn't do justice across the genders, which feels a shame. And as well, just for the listening experience, I don't think it was great. I don't think it added much. I personally felt that Gabrielle's narration was the better narration. It, probably largely just down to personal taste, to be honest, but hers really did pull me in more, was less monotone. The way that it was monotone felt in keeping with like the tone of the book, the seriousness of it and stuff like that, but there was a lot more expression in there. And then, yeah, it also made it difficult because there's a part at the end where then the characters from the poaching party are then in Damira's perspective, so she's then voicing them, and the age of the voice was completely off for Sviatoslav. Like, that just, it wasn't the same aged character done for the two of them. You know, I don't think they'd heard each other's part, so that pulled me out of it. And as well, especially because it's third person, it's not first person, so it's not even like you need it to be that character's voice.
It is, isn't it?
So to me it felt unnecessary, and I do kind of wish, for me, because it was the sample that I heard as well was Gabrielle's doing it, I think this would have been a better audiobook. And, you know, no disrespect at all to Stefan Rudnicki, I'm sure, you know, he was a very good narrator, and I'm sure a book on his own I could really get into, but for this one, I think if you'd just given it all to Gabrielle and done it all across that, then this would have been a much better audiobook, for me personally. What did you think?
Yeah, again, I think this is another, maybe the second or third book in this season where a narrator's voice has reminded me of a cartoon character. And that's Stefan's voice, unfortunately, did remind me of a particular cartoon character. And it just, that weird link in my head did take me out of the story. I think Stefan's got quite an interesting voice. I think in terms of it's kind of quite, not bass, but there's kind of like a reverberative quality to it. But I do agree with you. I don't think there was like, with his narration in particular, I don't think there was a kind of really clear delineation between the voices he had for Sivaslav and for Vladimir. So I don't.
Those perspectives sort of ended up blending. Like if you weren't concentrating, kind of like you were saying, they sort of blended a bit into one. You're like, which one's which? Because there was the real distinction, wasn't there? Because one of them was illegal poachers, and the other ones were people who had been allowed onto the reserve because they'd paid to as a way to fund the reserve. To kill one of the mammoths. So it's obviously, I think, an interesting thing in the ethics that is there really much difference. But for the story, and for the story asking us that question, I think there needed to be that kind of difference in the way we heard them. And we didn't want to blend those together.
So then maybe the question would be, do you think it might have worked better if there was 3 narrators, or do you think just, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think if either Stefan or Gabrielle had done the entire book, it probably would have gelled together a little bit tighter.
I think that personally, and just making sure that they were doing distinct stuff for the different characters, but that they could have held up a full book on its own. I think, cutting this down even further, for me, wouldn't have made it better, I don't think.
Okay, cool. So all the best sci-fi, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, it is just a way of positing like ethical questions to ourselves. And I was just wondering, you touched on kind of how the book talks about the ethics of game reserves, basically. How did you feel it kind of explored those ethical questions, and what were your kind of, I know this is kind of a big question, but kind of what were your main takeaways, and how did it make you feel about that?
I think it explored it really well. It was kind of a difficult one because you sort of feel, why are we giving so much airtime to these people that we don't like and we don't agree with, and that we think it's terrible that they're doing these things and stuff like that. There was a little bit of that, but there was also a little bit of that allowing us to explore the complexities of that. So I quite liked, there was some stuff about the poachers of the older generation explicitly, and their kind of like their relationship with alcohol to try and get over the horrible things they were doing, and that sort of kind of like almost like gang culture way of getting into poaching and stuff that was an interesting perspective. And then this idea of, on the other side, you have these respectable, in air quotes, people who are bloodthirsty and cruel, and how that comes in. And then this ethics of animal conservation, that constant thing of, it's a bit like, as well, this isn't one that's particularly touched on there, but obviously the ethics of like culling and things like that is obviously on the one hand really horrible, but then you also have to look at how ecosystems balance, and if they get out of balance, how much detriment that is to other species in the ecosystem, and various things like that. So that isn't particularly what's here, but it's a similar thing about how we want to preserve the mammoths. How do we do that? How do we have the money to do that? How do we have the protection from the poachers to do that and stuff like that? That was, I thought a lot of that was really interesting. And then as well, kind of the ivory trade in general. There was a particular quote that I thought was really impactful that was talking about one of the characters being away in China and being really far from where, the ivory poaching was happening, and yet they had all these trinkets and stuff like that were all made out of ivory. And the quote was that all this took place far away from the people who thought of ivory as a material. And that really struck because, the word ivory in, I think, most people's mind, it comes up as material before it comes up as tusk and,
yes.
Body part and thing like that. So I thought that was certainly one that really stuck out to me. And then it also I'm rambling, but lastly on this, another part was the ethics of revenge, I think is a big part here. And kind of the retaliation, and you find yourself rooting for violence and anger and retaliation, and then kind of step back and go, should we be rooting for that? I don't know, but it feels just, know, and that's a really tricky one, but an important one that I think it leaves you on, and a bit where I thought it did very well, melding story with message, because that aspect of Damira's story I felt was really well tied to the kind of ethics of it.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I didn't really... it addressed it a little bit in the book, but I didn't quite understand the economic drive for ivory in this world, because, maybe I've got a misunderstanding of what's happening in the world in terms of like ivory poaching at the moment, but the way it was described in the book was that there were like real wars over this, and the way it was explained in the book, I don't think I really understood that. Too much. So that was one question I kind of had lingering in my head. But I think one of the things I did enjoy about the book was how it explored how, again, kind of, we've talked about capitalism and stuff in the podcast before, how like, poverty is a real driver for this sort of behavior in terms of poaching, and how these poachers, they're not doing it because they hate the elephants. They're doing it because there's a market for it, and there's lots of poverty around, and this is the best way that they can kind of put food on the table for their family in these kind of like poor communities. And that's something that especially Sliverslav's character talks about a lot. He comes from like a family of basically a poor family of like alcoholics. His dad treats him pretty appallingly. So I found that kind of like quite interesting, because I think it does kind of not necessarily sympathize, but you can kind of find empathy with the motivations for them doing these terrible things. Yeah,
that's what I was going to say, is I think it toes a very good line between it doesn't excuse that behavior, it doesn't make that sympathetic, it certainly doesn't write it off, excuse it, but it explains more of the origins so you can understand it better, even though you don't excuse it, that kind of thing. And I think that part for me actually did ring really quite true, and felt that came across of the seriousness, the genuine warlike seriousness of poachers, and how that infringes on reserves and wild populations and things like that. And especially kind of, it brought the politics into it, and how kind of these poachers were attacking and threatening government officials because of the poaching and stuff like that. So I think that did ring quite true. And as well, because this is set in a future where elephants have already been driven out of extinction because of this poaching, and the way it talked about like that price change, that demand you're talking about, and the kind of like, you can imagine, as horrible as it is, that if you've had 50 years of no ivory or no new ivory, and then suddenly more becomes available, the greed and the everything being run in this kind of capitalist, commodity based kind of thing, that the value of that such rare thing would be ginormous, would be life changing for the people who went and stole it by killing the animals. So and it is definitely worth pointing out that this does have really quite upsetting and graphic depictions of poaching from the start as well, which I wasn't prepared for when I went in, and did make it a less enjoyable book than I was hoping for, but it was important for what the book was actually doing as opposed to what I'd gone into it thinking it would be doing.
Yeah, there is a fair amount of violence. There are violent scenes in this book. And it's not necessarily just the descriptions of violence, it's kind of also the emotional fallout of the violence as well. I think especially when Damira is talking about how some of her colleagues were killed. I think there's one particular colleague that you referred to earlier on. I think his name's Wamagunda, and he's the character that I think is from Africa and then saw these cultural artifacts. The way his death affects Damira is kind of quite devastating. So there is that as well. Yeah, so the other thing that I've kind of, the major thing I think I've got written down here is memories and the nature of memories. And I'm not too sure what the book was trying to say about the thing about mammoths not knowing how to be mammoths and having to be retaught their culture. I mean, do you think the story's trying to maybe make some comment on like cultural genocide? What do you think? Why do you think that was kind of the main kicking off point for the story?
You could be onto something there with that. That isn't what I'd read into it necessarily. I think partly because it is a really interesting idea. And that is what hooked me in really to this book, was that idea. And it was like last year or something like that, read an article about them looking to bring back the mammoth, and had like a ethical discussion with my in-laws about it. And an interesting thing that hadn't come up then was this idea of they're then not going to know how to be mammoths. So it's kind of, you also have it with just thinking of a more relatable comparison, you have it with like hand-reared kittens or puppies. They don't really know how to be cats and dogs, and animals that have ended up being raised with a kind of like surrogate mother of a different animal start acting like that one instead. There's interesting stuff like that. And animals in captivity not knowing how to be animals in the wild is another massive thing, another ethical thing about conservation. Is, should we be doing that if we're kind of stripping their wild animalness out of them? So I think that's a really interesting thought, that if you bring back a species where no other of the species exists, there's none for them to learn from, can they even succeed? If science can bring them back, but what about society as well? And so I thought that was really interesting concept. And I wish they'd explored it more, because I was kind of ready for more of like one of my favourite bits in his Dark Materials is the interactions with the Mulefa, Mary Malone and the Mulefa, and I wanted this book to be more like that. I wanted more of Damira as this elephant expert in the mind of a mammoth, teaching these mammoths how to be mammoths, or at least how to be elephants. And it touches on it a bit, not touches on, it does have it in there a bit, but I wish we'd had more of that. If this book were longer, kind of like we were saying before, I think more of that background, more of that even, emotion of her being in the tribe and stuff like that would have been really, really interesting. So yeah.
I agree with that. One of the things I think the book does do well is kind of how she experiences things as a mammoth. So there's a particular organ she talks about in the book where it helps her kind of like, she uses her trunk to kind of gather smells and put it up into this organ, which I believe is like in the roof of her mouth, and that helps her kind of like, she talks about the nature of like mammoth memories, and and then there are parts of the book where she's talking about how she's trying to guide this mammoth behavior. And I think one of the more interesting aspects of it is how her human nature is changing the way that the mammoths, quote unquote, like natural inclinations are, especially in terms of like reacting violently to human beings, essentially.
I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, definitely. And certainly the memory as well, listening to this podcast will know I definitely find the theme of memory really, really interesting in books. And this kind of, it sort of takes the elephants never forget line to the extreme, doesn't it? And you very much have mixing that with the sci-fi of this kind of implanted mind. You have moments that are kind of similar to what we had in Once a Monster that we listened to,
where
the character is sort of living in 2 time zones. They're sort of living in the present, but they're also feel their memories so vividly that it's like they're living in them as well. And I thought that was really cool. And I thought there was a nice mechanism for the kind of, flashback, flash forward, change in time zones kind of thing, as well as just, memory being really interesting and how bits of her memory come back to her and stuff like that. So there was kind of a revelation that she has about this toy elephant that she was given as a child, and that kickstarting her whole, career and life path and stuff like that. And that's something that felt really close to me as well, because I had a toy elephant from before I was born that was Poppy's elephant, and then I've had elephant toys since, and my closest toys have been elephant toys. And I also I had to listen to this in headphones when I was in my room, because I felt really horrible that my elephant toys were hearing all the nasty poaching things. But so that really emotionally got to me. I felt very connected to that. But then there's an interesting bit with memory where she has a revelation about that toy that kind of affects her in the present and stuff like that. So I thought all that memory stuff was really interesting and cool, both from that kind of like the animal side and the mechanism of the story side, but also from that sci-fi side. What would it be like if you are implanted, and that kind of thing of, am I this person? Did I even experience this stuff? Those kind of cool questions as well.
Yeah, one of my favourite parts in the book is that where there's a bit where Damira kind of does something, and then like the other elephants are kind of like questioning, not necessarily questioning, but it's kind of like, that kind of, why are we doing this thing? And then she realises she's kind of made a permanent impact in terms of because mammoth / elephant memory is long, and that behaviour now is embedded, and she kind of questions herself about whether that is like the ethical thing or the right thing to do. So I felt that was, and that's one of the things I think that does go through the book, kind of characters doing something and then kind of questioning themselves about whether or not it's the right thing to do or not. And then it's not just Damira's character that has these bits where they are kind of reminiscing. I think both Vladimir and Slivoslav have bits of the book where they are reminiscing about their past, especially kind of Vladimir and his parts of his relationship with like Anthony, kind of him kind of questioning kind of like whether or not he should have seen certain signs before or not. But how did you feel about kind of Vladimir and Anthony's relationship?
It's a very strange one, isn't it? Because it was this idea that he likes the man that isn't this trophy hunter, and the can you reconcile the two together, and can he still love him, which is sort of it was a strange, it sort of felt like, I don't know, to me, I understand your point that it was the closest to that kind of thrillery thing. For me, partly just, again, based on my preconceptions of what I thought the story was about, it became a bit of a, I could lose it kind of thing. But I did feel like I ended up quite invested in it, even though it's sort of like, you knew that. Why are you thinking that? Like, it's not a huge surprise, and you knew he wanted to do this. So some of that was a bit strange, but I did find myself drawn in, and I certainly felt like the Vladimir's character felt the most, or one of the most fleshed out kind of thing. You spend quite a lot of time with him and quite a lot in his inner mind. So it did leave an impact on the story, I think. Yeah,
I think one of the issues I maybe had with the book was that the 3 point of view characters are kind of kept apart for quite a long period of time, and I wasn't really quite sure how they would be interacting with each other. Yes, it's kind of it was an interesting choice that he made there in terms of like keeping them so far apart until kind of until the conclusion of the story. I don't think I've got any other notes on this. Is there anything that you've got written down?
I think I have a few things. So there's something about the memory that we were talking about as well. So there was a quote here that I really liked that was returning to a memory like returning to a pocket to check for your keys. And that I thought was really impactful and a really cool metaphor for that kind of retrospective, for that going back into your past kind of thing. It felt like a really good description. I really liked that one. And so in general, I thought that the writing, with bits like that in it, but also just the writing style in general, I really liked it. It was my kind of style.
Written, I felt it was really beautiful. Was. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I've got written down here. Really beautiful and really engaging. Certainly to my taste. I really liked the writing style, which is why, I would have liked more of it and a more fully developed story. But, the more we've been talking about this, the more I've been feeling like I've been harsh on that. Because, we've been pulling out, and this character made this impact and this bit of the story was really well explored. So, maybe I need to reevaluate how I thought of it. But certainly when I was first listening, I was a bit disappointed that there wasn't more story and that so many good ideas, and not just ideas of like the very initial idea stage and from the blurb, but parts of Damira's character and her story that I thought were great and wish they'd just been explored more and stuff like that. So yeah, I kind of hadn't enjoyed it as much as I thought I would, or as much as I'd wanted to, but I did enjoy it. And yeah, talking it through with you has almost made me realised I liked it more than I was giving it credit for.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a couple of weeks since I've listened to it, so when I did initially finish listening to it, it was kind of like one of those things where I wanted it. It's really curious. It did that thing where you wanted more of the world and more of the story, but then you've got to sometimes trust a writer's instincts. Kind of like, this is as long as I think the story needs to be without overstaying its welcome. But I think the world that he's created is definitely rich enough to kind of support other stories and characters. Maybe not necessarily about mammoths, but I think there's a really interesting political question that he asks in the book. In a world where you can kind of implant memories into basically any living creature, what dangers does that pose for like democracy and stuff like that? So yeah, I felt that was there's definitely maybe like another like political thriller coming that you could kind of base in this world. So yeah,
this is a very different tone, but you're just making me think of the Futurama episode where Nixon gets a massive robot body.
yeah. So, well, I mean, that's basically sort of one of the questions they pose in the book, isn't it? So yeah,
there's certainly the same kind of thing that Futurama does ask: if you can upload a politician's mind, can they just keep being the leader forever? Kind of thing is sort of suggested, isn't it? And especially when you're talking about kind of Moscow and Russia and their politics, where this is set. It's asking a lot of pertinent questions for those kinds of things, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, kind of probably not relevant to a discussion at the moment, but I'm rewatching one of my favorite TV shows of the last 10 years, The Americans, which is about the Soviet spies posing as a normal American family in the United States. And some of the language they use in that TV show is kind of mirrored in this book. So there's kind of like, I found that quite interesting, especially considering how Ukraine is still in the news and stuff like that. So yeah, I felt that that's kind of I think it's kind of probably quite pointed commentary on political leaders and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, interesting. I'll have to try that one. And on that as well, I thought back on the narration, I really did like the accents in it. I thought the balance of that was really good, and the accents were, really engaging and immersive and stuff like that. I thought that was good across both narrators' performances. I liked that.
There was one question I wanted to kind of ask you about, and this is probably just down to my ignorance of like people. Do you feel like, and I'm probably using the wrong word here, but with Sliverstav's character, do you feel that he was kind of, there was like some sort of like comment on like indigenous populations?
There was some of it, I think there wasn't there? Because there was about there was certainly him interacting with one of the other people in the party about this guy who kind of chooses his own ethnicity based off who he's talking to. So kind of does he go down the heritage of the indigenous peoples of Russia or the kind of modern invasion-y people of Russia? I don't really know how to describe it, but he sort of has it of kind of like city and rural is one way that he sort of splits his personality, but it is definitely based off those different communities. That is definitely another bit that's touched on. There's so much in this book where it does touch on some things that would be really interesting if they were developed further. I almost feel like that bit almost wanted to be a different book, and the stuff with Damira wanted to be a book on its own and stuff like that, and the can you love someone who wants to go poach an animal could be a different story as well. I almost think if they were 3 separate longer or that length stories, that would have been better than smushing them all together.
I mean I would have really loved a book about like Damira and Wamagunda's adventures. Adventures is probably the wrong word, but they're kind of like their fight to save elephant. That would have been like an excellent book, because you've got a lot of the same themes that would be explored in this, and as well as there, Damira kind of does talk a lot about like her upbringing and her family and her mother and stuff like that. That could have been a book on its own, kind
Definitely,
of like, it's kind of like, I do hope he goes back to this world and kind of fleshes it out with maybe different stories and different characters. There are a couple of characters I'd be really interested to see what happens to them in the future, especially not the gamekeeper. That's the wrong word. The president of the preserve, kind of what happens to him afterwards, and then
Constantine.
Constantine. So it'd be interesting. Maybe we can write our own fan fiction. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Or someone write it for us, and we'll review that one as well.
Yeah.
That'd be good. Yeah. So, I think my review of this is that it wasn't the book I wanted it to be, and I don't think it was the book that it could have been, but there is so much good stuff in there, and although some of it was really unpleasant to listen to, I am glad that I listened to this. And I think it definitely does sit well with the review we did for The Nightfield as well, where I felt like the eco message does come across well, but some stuff at the beginning about trying to make it confusing, just make it more simple, and then we can follow the story. And then for both, again, you could have developed more of the character in the story and still had the same strength of message of everything that you put in there about the eco side of it. You don't need to dilute that at all to just also bring in all the character and everything like that to match it. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think this is well worth listening to or reading. I think it'd be kind of quite interesting to kind of maybe read this, because I do think it's fairly short. It's a really good sci-fi story. It asks really interesting ethical questions by putting you in this world where these amazing sci-fi things can kind of happen. I think he does a fantastic job of building a believable future, and a future that is quite plausible and very scary. Definitely. Very scary. And, if you're a fan of like something like Jurassic Park or something like that, and you're looking for something that poses interesting dilemmas about conservation, I think this is definitely a great book to listen to. My only comments would be, and it's a great compliment criticism to give to it, but I just wish it was longer. I'd highly recommend this. Awesome. Okay, cool. So thank you very much everyone for listening. Please continue to support the pod. It really helps us out when you leave a rating or review wherever you find us. You can contact us on social media at audiobookishpod, and you can email us at audiobookishpod@gmail.com. We're currently looking for guests to appear on the podcast, so do get in touch with us about that. Okay, guys, thank you very much. We'll see you later. Bye.